Welcome back, class. Mr. Offer. This is History 1301. This is section 3 of part 2 of the 8-week course. Now, we talked about the Pilgrims, and I kind of let you guys know that, we always think about that big Thanksgiving feast. And, and normally when that's taught in school, we hear that's because the Indians and the Pilgrims met together. The Indians helped the Pilgrims plant crops and they all became friends. That's all true. But the backside of that was also that particular Indian tribe needed the Pilgrims and the weaponry that they had to wipe out and kill another tribe. That's always kind of an interesting thing that Miss Johnson's fourth grade class probably won't talk about. Now, in this one, we're going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about the indentured servant program and slavery. Guys, I usually take about an hour per subject on each one of these. This has got to be done in 5 to 6 minutes. Indentured servant program. What this was, it was a program that was developed in Europe. And what they would do is the plantation owners, or the people, not only plantation owners, the colonists, would contact their contacts in Europe, and they would basically get employees, workers, however you want to put it, from Europe. They called them indentured servants. Now, this program was that they were looking for people with certain skill sets, usually laborers. That was the main thing, because you had huge plantations at this time. Cotton and tobacco had both been developed, especially tobacco up on that East Coast with Virginia. And there were thousands and thousands of crops of tobacco that needed to be harvested. And the plantation owner had to find people to do it. Now, what the indentured servant program was about is they took Europeans, and the people that came over here, they paid for their passage, number one, but you had to work for them up to 7 years. You had to give your time. You signed a contract and you came over here. Usually the work was very hard, very brutal. A lot of the indentured servants would eventually run away. They had to be recaptured. And a lot of them would end up staying, and they would end up acquiring land. Then they would be a landowner. So this was called the indentured servant program. It did not last very long. And the main reason why is the people, they thought it was, and I've always thought this was interesting, they thought it was a little bit inhumane to make these people sign a contract for 7 years. But what the indentured servant program does, guys, it is the doorway that will open the doorway to the slave market in this continent. Now, don't get me wrong, there had already been slaves. The first slave ship that first came to this continent actually was blown off course. A group of pirates had taken this slave ship from the slave traders, and they brought these slaves, and they basically traded the slaves for food and supplies and left out. That was the first slave ship that ever came here. Those were the first slaves that ever came here. So we already had slavery here. But the indentured servant program will open the door to that, because once they bring these indentured servants over, and the plantation owners are saying, well, these guys, I can only have these people for 7 years. If I buy a slave, then I own this poor person for the rest of his life, or the rest of her life. So it opens that doorway into slavery. Guys, we'll end this lecture really quickly with, and I'm not going to give you an ethical lecture into slavery. All nations through the world have had slavery. I tell most of my students, if you could trace your heritage back far enough, your people were probably slaves. My people came from Germany. Germans, the Germanic tribes, were taken slaves by the Roman armies during that time. So we have probably all descended somewhere of slaves. Slavery is a terrible, wrong, bad institution. Okay. And it always aggravates me when I teach this face to face. I'll usually have one student that after class wants to come up and give me the, it wasn't that bad. They treated these slaves really good. No, they didn't. Slaves were abused, they were tortured, they were mutilated, they were kept in bondage. So slavery is it's a bad institution, and I don't have enough time to preach to you, and I'm not going to do that because I'm teaching you history. But the indentured servant program will bring slavery here because it introduces this labor. And once especially your southern plantation owners are going to really exploit the slaves, because they're going to find out, like for instance, they're doing rice when they're in the areas that are producing rice. There's a group of they're from Angola, Africa. I got to get that right. It's a group of slaves that come from this area of Africa that were very extreme heat and humidity because of where they were from did not bother them. And so these plantation owners found these people were excellent in the development of rice up on that East Coast. So this will introduce us into slavery. This brings in, and I've always thought it was interesting, the first slave ship, guys, that actually came to this continent was blown off course, and it was a ship that was overtaken by pirates that brought these slaves in this ship up on the East Coast, just wanted to trade them. Now, the interesting thing on that, guys, is those slaves were actually given Christian names, which I think the intention was to free them again. So we'll end this section. We have talked about the indentured servant program. We've talked about now the slave program. Guys, slavery will truly be the albatross around our neck. Slavery, once we get to this point in this course, you see, we're going to continue to have problems with the fact that as our country expands and grows, every question has to be, will it be a slave state? Will it be a free state? We'll talk more about that. We'll talk about people like Thomas Jefferson, who really had some interesting ideas on slavery. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So when we come back, we're going to be on part 3 of what will be this part 5 series. And we'll see you guys then. Bye.